Great enthusiasm in the room, I can tell. Because people are already starting to talk. Thanks everyone for coming. I mean, if you come to these regularly, you're used to seeing Jeff Pasley. I'm not Jeff Pasley. He's out of town this weekend. I know a lot of you, but not all of you. I know you from Wire. No? Yeah. Okay. Hi. Okay. Hi. My name is Catherine Rimpf. I'm a professor in the history department. I'm an affiliate of the Kinder Institute. I'm currently serving as interim director of the Honors College. And I'm really pleased that so many of you are here this afternoon to hear our speaker. I'm just going to give you a few words of introduction. Colin Gordon is professor of history at the University of Iowa. He's written books on the New Deal, on the politics of healthcare in America, on inequality in the United States. And at some point in the, I don't know, mid to late-ish aughts, I don't know exactly when, he kind of started getting interested in the history of segregation in St. Louis. And in 2008, he published his book, Mapping Decline, St. Louis and the Fate of the American City. I know there are people here who have read this book and own this book. And if you own this book, it has beautiful, amazing maps in it. The maps are also available online so that you can go and look at them there. And he's continued to be interested in this complex subject of segregation in St. Louis ever since then. The project he's going to be talking about today is actually his third project, and I asked him if he was writing a trilogy, and he said that the one he's talking about today is actually the prequel.
This is the Phantom Menace.
Yes, the Phantom Menace to whatever the first Star Wars is called. We're not supposed to call it Star Wars. No, it has a name. My son is always correcting me on it. The Last Hope or the Final Hope. So anyway, it doesn't matter. He was, and everyone really wants me to say this. He was one of the first, if not the first, speakers to come under the auspices of the Kinder Institute. I think maybe even before it was called an institute, when it was called a forum. Is that correct, Allison? Yes. So he came back in the fall of 2014. That was right after the events in Ferguson. And the killing of Michael Brown, and he came here and spoke about segregation in St. Louis at that time. He was speaking about the project he was working on at the time, which was published in 2019, Citizen Brown, Race, Democracy, and Decline in the St. Louis Suburbs. That book also has online maps that you can look at, and Rachel Breckus wants me to tell everyone that that book is available as an ebook through Ellis Library. Did I get that right?
Yep, multi-user ebook.
Multi-user, so more than one person. Sorry, we're throwing you under the bus here, Colin.
No, but buy it so you can write in it.
There you go. Yeah. These are beautiful books. So his scholarly accomplishments are many, but he also has a very strong commitment to something I know is near and dear to the hearts of people in this room, which is that he's really committed to publicly engaged scholarship. So he writes these amazing monographs, but he's also written policy reports on health coverage and economic development for Common Good Iowa, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan institute that promotes policy solutions related to families and communities in the great state of Iowa. He also publishes regularly in venues like Dissent and Jacobin and The Nation. This year, he has an NEH fellowship for the new project, the prequel to the trilogy, which is called Dividing the City, about race-restrictive covenants in St. Louis. And he's living in St. Louis this semester, so we thought it would be a good time to get him to come over to Columbia and talk about this project. I just spent about an hour talking to him about the research, it's really interesting just getting down into, for those of you who are historians, who like to spend time in the archives, just the details of what these records look like is really interesting. apart from all of the interesting things that he's finding. So we are very fortunate to have Professor Gordon here with us this afternoon. So let's please give him a warm welcome.
Well, thanks for having me. What I'm talking about today is based on ongoing research, which means a couple of things. So the conclusions are going to be a little bit preliminary and the talk a little bit descriptive. But it also means that I run the danger of of sliding into the weeds of what I'm looking at every day. So the talk is not particularly formal, it's sort of image driven, but feel free to interrupt if I say something that is not abundantly clear. So what I'm going to talk about today, which I think is a sort of emerging line of research in the history of the segregation of American cities generally, and I'll talk about why it's emerging in a moment, is a history of private restrictions that are embedded in subdivision indentures, individual property deeds, and as we'll see in St. Louis, in neighborhood petitions. So the source for this are the recorder's deed books in St. Louis City and St. Louis County. And they look sort of like this. This one's from 1893. This is an indenture, again, dated 1893, which is a sale of a piece of land from Matthew and Annie Sullivan to the grantee, Emma Ward. And then there's a legal description of the land, which is the sort of frontage on Minerva Avenue, although county recorders don't use addresses, they use legal descriptions. So it's always a city block number or its relationship to a survey marker and that sort of thing. And in 1893, this restriction, and this is from the recorder's deed book, included the provision that the owner would not sell, convey, transfer any of his property to colored people. This, as far as we can tell, is the first race-restrictive covenant in the city of St. Louis. 57 years later, 2 years after the Supreme Court held such agreements unenforceable, Cyrus Crane Fillmore, the developer of St. Louis Hills in southwestern St. Louis, a large subdivision, wrote this indenture for the last phase of that development, which again, that any person or person not of the Caucasian race should be prohibited from living in this subdivision. So these private restrictions were extremely important in the first half of the 20th century because they stood in lieu of what we now think of being what is controlled by zoning and building codes, both of which were completely sort of undeveloped at the time. So these private restrictions included restrictions on building and design, what your house could be made of, where it could be placed on the lot, that sort of thing. It often included very, especially for subdivisions, elaborate sort of governance, like who would be the trustees, what would be their powers to assess property owners to do improvements, that sort of thing. They typically took care of whatever easements had to be made for like sewers and utility lines and the sort of public uses of property. They often had public safety provisions, so no burning of coal, no wooden roofs, anything that would sort of control the behavior of your neighbors in order to control the value or safety of your property. And they controlled nuisances. Right? You can't have pigs, you can't have chickens, no commercial uses. Typically in St. Louis and St. Louis County, there's a list of nuisances, which is liveries, stables, slaughterhouses, rag picking establishments, and white lead factories. So apparently neighborhood white lead factories were quite common. But foremost among the nuisance restrictions was a restriction against racial occupancy. And as the 20th century moves on, as we move into the 30s and 40s, it really becomes the only restriction placed on property. This is an example of one of these restrictions. This is one of my favorites. So this is from St. Louis County, where a large devoutly Catholic developer, had two restrictions. One that it was for whites only, but also you had to have at least 4 kids. In the 1940s, on the eve of the Shelley versus Kramer decision, people who studied race in the United States recognized these restrictions as fundamental to the system of what Douglas Massey and Nancy Denton would call American apartheid, or the sort of Jim Crow of the North, the rigid form of segregation, far more rigid than anywhere in the South, that was carving up northern cities like Chicago, Detroit, and St. Louis. Robert Weaver, who would go on to become Secretary of HUD under Lyndon Johnson, always held that this was, as he called it, the original sin of segregation. And yet, despite the fact that we have this sort of contemporary testimony and scholarly assessment as well that these are fundamental, we know very little about them. And this is why. They're buried in county deed records. And county deed records are, for the most part, handwritten. And their only index is by buyer and seller, grantor and grantee. And the order of documents in county deed records is the order in which people to walk through the door on that day of business. So you'll have a sewer lien and a sheriff's sale and a tax abatement and a conventional sale of property and a quitclaim and then a race-restrictive agreement, and then you'll start all over again. So they're extremely difficult to find. And indeed, when Herman Long and Charles Johnson were hired by the NAACP in the 1940s to try and do a study of St. Louis and Chicago and how extensive they were, they spent one day in the recorder's office in St. Louis and left saying, there's no way that we could do this. And we're able to draw this map only because the White Realtors Trade Association said, oh, we know where they all are. Here's a list. But it turned out to be a very partial map because the real estate exchange only gave Long and Johnson a list of the agreements that they had been responsible for drafting, which, as you'll see, turned out to be less than half of those in the city of St. Louis. So overcoming this sort of document or archival bottleneck is a really interesting problem. And there's a workaround. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the project in Minneapolis called Map and Prejudice. What's happened in county recorders' offices over the last 10 years is because of the absolute archaic and time-intensive way of dealing with those records, all of which have to be assembled every time a property changes hands. One more piece of paper and give it to the next property owner. But the big title firms basically have successfully lobbied state legislatures to digitize records and provide them on the basis of subscription. So the title companies and the developers don't have to go down to the county recorder's office, opening up plat books, right, and ordering copies at exorbitant fees. Now this opens up, of course, huge research opportunities once these are digitized, because in Hennepin County, Minneapolis, or Minnesota, for example, and in this case, Johnson County, Iowa, these records are fully digitized, high-resolution images, and they're typed. So you could just do an OCR scrape of the whole record for word stems like, the first four letters are Caucasian or restriction or that sort of thing. And so the Minneapolis project was able to map down to the parcel level every restriction in the state of Minneapolis by sort of crowdsourcing this trove of documents. And I was able to do the same thing in Johnson County with students because I was given the high resolution scans that had gone to the vendor and just assembled my own digital plat books or deed books and went through them. Well, it turns out that that's a pretty rare combination of circumstances. And in fact, in St. Louis and St. Louis County, the records are handwritten into the 1940s. So if, even once you get to the end of the 1930s, when some of these restrictive agreements run 16 or 17 pages, I would come into the recorder's office with my 16 pages of typed restrictions, and the recorder, like a monk, would start writing it out by hand in the deed book. And they would write all 17 pages into the deed book. And that's what the record looks like. It makes it makes it impossible to do any sort of optical character recognition scan of the records, of cursive writing. So we needed another way in. And it turned out, for the same reason that today title companies have pressed to have these records digitized, early on in the century, the title companies just started keeping their own track of where the restrictions were. And we stumbled across, in the files of one of the big title companies in St. Louis, an 80-page catalog of every restrictive agreement in the city of St. Louis, which enabled us to go directly to the deed book and pull that document. And they actually listed which ones were racial restrictions, although this turned out to be an unreliable marker, and we actually looked at every one that they had listed as a restriction. And the reason this is important is, this is the deed book number, which is deed book 4154, page 417. Deed book has 625 to 650 pages. And by 1925, there were 4,000 of them in the city of St. Louis. So we're talking about 7 to 10 million pages to cover the time period that I'm talking about. So we got this catalog for the city of St. Louis, and I'll show you the results in a bit. In the county itself kept a restriction file, alphabetically by subdivision. So you can go into this restriction file and pull out, the cards and look for any subdivisions that were platted between 1900 and 1950. They give you a deed book number. You can then go to the deed books, pull it, read through the horrid cursive handwriting, and find the restrictions. I had limited success with student interns on this project because a lot of them couldn't read cursive. Seriously. And this is what one of the subdivision restrictions look like. So this is for Ladue Wood, which is now in the sort of Tony Central County municipality of Ladue. This would be a 10 or 15 page document. Again, indenture of restrictions for Ladue Wood, and there's the restriction against race. And this is roughly what it looks like with the research to date. So we finished the city of St. Louis and found 763 unique agreements and then a number of renewals as well, covering about 30,000 residential parcels, which is about a quarter to a third of the city's residential property base in 1940. In the county, I'm only up to the late 1930s, and you can see how dense the pattern of restriction already is. So my guess is that this is about half of the restrictions in the county. Almost all subdivision-based. I'll get to the color coding in a little bit. And so far, about 50,000 parcels in the county. The language of restriction is very interesting. The most common in St. Louis is this clause. This is from the uniform agreement written by the realtors. So almost all of the agreements contain some version of this. In the county, what you see most commonly is developers just saying, you must be holding a Caucasian blood. But there's lots of interesting variations. You do see creeping in, particularly in some of the earlier restrictions, a more sort of eugenics-based kind of catalog of prohibited categories, often mixing race, religion, national origin together, or using archaic terms for Asians, in this case Mongols or Malays. University City is pretty much completely covered by restrictions against Negroes or Malays. Negroes are objectionable for foreign-born people, or sometimes long descriptions. A lot of anxiety in terms of what was a racial category. So no Negroes, nor person of the Negro or dark race, no Filipinos, no Hawaiians, nor any Jews, any Chinese, or any person of the Chinese race, which are apparently different categories. Occasionally just using the marker of white. Often using African descent or African blood. And in one case, this comes straight out of Louisiana, a sort of 1/32 rule. In this case, the proportion of Negro blood would be determined by the property owner, by the appearance of the person. And almost always, and I'll show you some examples of this in a moment, side by side, in what is generally a sort of nuisance clause. So it's often this sort of cadence of, your house has to be this big, it has to be built of this, you can't have any chickens and no Negroes. So that's the sort of cadence of the standard restriction. One thing that's particularly interesting, both in comparing St. Louis to other cities and even to St. Louis County, are the different kinds of restrictions. And so the color coding here, the orange are subdivisions, and so these are, large single units of development, 100 to 1,000 houses, where the restriction is imposed by the original developer. Next most popular in St. Louis is the petition, which is this area here, which I'll come back to. These are done in older neighborhoods where they weren't restricted at the time they were built, but they're facing racial transition. And so the realtors or, some sort of AstroTurf neighborhood organization that they put together, goes door to door and collects petitions. And that's the kind of agreement that the Shelley case actually revolved around. Also in St. Louis, there are a few restrictions on private streets, although most of those are built so early and are so exclusive, they don't actually have occupancy restrictions. But the few of them you see in green do. The private streets are like where the McCloskeys live, right in Portland Place, is where they, the owners assess themselves for the streets, and the streets, not a public right of way. And then scattered throughout the city are these blue parcel restrictions, which are on individual sales or on 2 or 3 lots at a time. So not enough to count as a subdivision. That's the property on Minerva that I started with would be one of those. And those are mostly early on. Subdivision restrictions, again, look like this. This one's from St. Louis County. What's interesting in the county, and really sort of interesting from a research perspective, is for a period of time, they're just written directly on the plat map. So you get these beautiful architectural renderings of the subdivision. You know, sometimes these are hand colored, and then, you know, they'll have off to the side this sort of list of restricted categories. And this was widely recognized in the marketing of some subdivisions at the time, although unlike other settings where I've looked at, the advertisements for subdivisions never mention race. They just mention that it's a highly restricted district, although Maryland Terrace was restricted by race, so was this one in the case of Fox Meadows. So they do this language of exclusion and restriction, but rarely spell out what that was actually in the advertising. And then there were these petition restrictions. And again, these were almost all done by the St. Louis Real Estate Exchange, which was the White Realtors Trade Association, to the point where by the late 1930s, they had a uniform restriction agreement that they would just provide to neighborhood groups or use themselves going door to door. And it had a standard clause, which was these sort of 2 definitions of nuisances, one which was junk shops, slaughterhouses, and rag picking establishments, the other which was Negro occupancy. Most of these restrictions, particularly the ones in the city, have a 25-year term. It's typical in property law to respect what's called the rule against perpetuities. You can't establish a restriction on a piece of property that goes on forever. So usually you make it run for a generation, for 25 years. But then there are often those sort of elaborate mechanisms for having it automatically renewed. And occasionally you come across one. I came across one the other day that was written in 1908, and it just says this restriction will last till January 2008, 100 years. So here's the pattern of those in St. Louis. And again, we finished the mapping in St. Louis, and so it's a very sort of interesting pattern. You see early on in 1910, a few of these subdivisions in the southwest quadrant of the city are starting to use these restrictions. Scattered individual property sales around the city. A couple of the early private streets have racial restrictions. And then the real estate exchange is starting the task of surrounding the Ville, the sort of old established African-American neighborhood, with restrictions trying to prevent its expansion. And what's interesting is this is the Shelley restriction. It's the first petition restriction in the city of St. Louis. It runs for 50 years from the date of its signing. Jump ahead 5 years, not much has happened, because what happens after 1910, even between 1910 and 1920, is the realtors and others in St. Louis shift their attention from these agreements to a full-blown racial zoning ordinance, which the city passes in 1916 it's a public referendum that passes by a 2-to-1 vote. It's struck down by the Supreme Court alongside other racial zoning ordinances a year later. So after that, the realtors get much more active trying to use race restrictions, but mostly after 1920, because it's not so much a response to the Supreme Court decision against racial zoning, or as some have suspected, to the East St. Louis race riot during World War I. It really has more to do with the timing of the first Great Migration and the professionalization of these sorts of standards in the realty and development industry. So we start to see this dramatically in the early 1920s. And so I'll play that again. The red there is over 400 separate neighborhood agreements between 1920 and 1925. That's when virtually all of it is done. They draw a line around the Ville and say, you're not going any further north, any further south. I'll come back to this because it's an interesting part of the story. And as we move forward in time, you see the southwest quadrant of the city, which is being developed at this time, sort of large subdivisions, uses this pretty systematically. Much of this development is St. Louis Hills being built in various stages. Until we get to 1950, and so this is just a couple of years after the Shelley versus Kramer decision. So this is a large swath of the city's residential property base. This is mostly a mixed-use commercial area. This downtown Mill Creek Valley is in the process of being raised by the time we get to 1950, and it's mostly rental housing. And so the city's big residential footprints are here and here, single-family residential footprints. And the timing of this is very interesting as we see the different forms of restriction over time in the city. And I think what's interesting about this are a couple things. One is you do see this lag in interest while they're working on the zoning ordinance. It's like, why are we going to do this block by block? We can just do it for the whole city, which is what they do. And so, a few subdivisions, but, this is the Shelley versus Kramer restriction here. And then you don't really get to take off until the 1920s. And then, there's this big spike in the 1920s where it's really just the professional standard in the subdivisions in the orange, but also it's when the real estate exchange is most active. Then what's interesting is this second lag in the 1930s. And what really has happened here is the real estate exchange has surrounded the Ville. They're done. They're hemmed in. We're good. And of course, the big developers grind to a halt during the Great Depression. So there's no new subdivisions being built. And then it starts building again in the 1940s. And so the subdivisions here, this is a response to the second Great Migration. But what's also interesting is, remember, these agreements run 25 years. And so the real estate goes in and starts renewing them for another 25 years. And so these are variations on the first generation of restriction. And one thing I think is very important to recognize in this sort of larger argument about the segregated American city is that it's this era of private restriction which creates segregation. So here I've just graphed the dissimilarity index, which is the most common measure of segregation, where the closer you get to the number 1, the more absolutely segregated you are. This, roughly speaking, it measures the percent of a given population that you would have to move to achieve true integration, okay? And it varies a little bit depending on the size of the unit that you use, because you're comparing, what the segregation does is it compares the composition of a unit like a census tract or a ward to the whole. But the important thing here is not those details, it's just the trajectory. All of the segregation in St. Louis is accomplished between 1910 and 1940. After that, it's high, but remains flat. So what comes after, the more famous history of redlining and that sort of thing, sustains the initial segregation, but it doesn't create it. And again, we can look at that pattern of segregation, which in some respects, is fairly obvious. So again, I go back to the sort of monster map of all the restrictions. Here, placed on top of the distribution of the population by race in 1940. And you can see some interesting patterns. One is there's a lot of activity on racial restriction in the parts of the county here near Kinloch, here near North Webster Groves, where there is an African-American population. So Overland and all of that are particularly active in trying to hem in this pocket of African-American occupancy, which is called Delmar Park. You also see this pattern of fairly exclusive subdivision development through Central County, Clayton, Richmond Heights, Ladue, parts of University City. And you see this sort of active petition-based effort to hem in the Ville on North St. Louis by completely surrounding it with this circle of restriction. It's also interesting, I think, if we look at this at a very sort of local perspective. So St. Louis infamously has this sort of Delmar Divide between North and South St. Louis. And the existence of that divide owes itself very much to the pattern of racial restriction. And so here we have, This is Delmar. And this maps the distribution of the African-American population, in this case in 1920, by using the enumeration districts from the census, which are very small units, sort of like a census block unit. So it gives a much finer grained sense of where African-Americans lived. And so you see, they're starting to write these restrictions along the northern boundary of the Ville, trying to keep it from African-American occupants moving this way. And then that period of particular activity in the 1920s. And so the ones in dark red are all the ones that are new in 1922. The lighter red is the ones that are already established. But there's a particular problem here posed for the real estate exchange. They want to hem in the Ville, which is this, the green line here. But there's an established swath of African-American occupancy at Finney and Cook Avenue, just north of Delmar. They don't know what to do about it. And in fact, they talk constantly about it and actually negotiate with the Urban League and with African-American realtors over the fate of these blocks. Where, some of the African-American realtors, including James Bush, who was the realtor in the Shelley case, are working with the real estate exchange to say, look, we'll respect all of these if you give us to Delmar, because it's ridiculous for you to try to hold on to these blocks. The real estate exchange, was in some cases caved in, but their larger logic was, we don't want to give up on any of these because we don't want to set the precedent that just because it failed, we're not going to enforce it anymore. And then they're faced with the further challenge that throughout this period of the early 1920s, I'll just jump ahead to 1923, all of the legal challenges to restrictions in this area are coming from white homeowners whose parents signed a restriction, and now they can't get out of the neighborhood because the real estate exchange won't let them sell. So the combination of the sort of complaints of white homeowners of being stuck in these neighborhoods and the pressure from Urban League and black realtors is starting to sort of shift the real estate exchange's attention. They keep writing these restrictions on this strip. This is sort of Page and Easton Avenue, which is now Martin Luther King, just south of the Ville. But eventually, they sort of give up and they start drawing the line at Delmar instead. They start writing a series of restrictions along Delmar. As you can see, that's now the real dividing line. And then what's also interesting is at this time, they're also working pretty actively with the city on zoning and land use issues to say, look, if you make Delmar a commercial street, put a median down the middle, that'll make it a hard boundary. And then you're guaranteed that you have a school district or an elementary school catchment zone, one that faces this way and one that faces this way, right? So kids don't cross the street. And then they start writing the restrictions in the early 30s in a big way south of Delmar, because it no longer makes sense to write them across Delmar because Delmar is now all commercial. You can't restrict commercial property to racial occupancy. So they move a block south to Washington Terrace and cover it with restriction. And what's interesting is in the next 20 years, what this will mean is when Shelley versus Kramer is decided, all of these become unenforceable. But this line has been drawn with a variety of mechanisms, with covenants being one of them. And so the sort of ragged donut around the Ville is replaced with this hard north-south boundary. Now, as I've mentioned it a number of times, the Supreme Court steps in, partly based on a case that begins in St. Louis, the Shelley case on Labadie Avenue, but combining it with a case from Washington, D.C. and a case from Michigan, and rules race-restrictive covenants unenforceable under the Equal Protection Clause in 1948. Up until that point, the state and the Supreme Court had pretty consistently held that these were private contracts. People could enter any kind of private contract they wanted. The NAACP was eventually able to persuade the Supreme Court that the restrictions themselves were fine, but the enforcement of them constituted state action, and so it violated the Equal Protection Clause. But because only the state enforcement is banned, that's why you see them continue to be written in 1948, 49, 1950, because especially the big developers are hoping that they can enforce them by other means. And what's also important in the sort of post-Shelley history is that they lived on in other forms. So they became fundamental to the practice of private appraisal. So this is a private appraisal form from the 1930s, and you can see, racial considerations, racial influence, percent equal population, and the presence of deed restrictions were crucial to valuing this house. And none of that changed with Shelley versus Kramer. And they became embedded in public forms of appraisal, what we generally call redlining. So when the Homeowners Loan Corporation, during the sort of home building crisis of the Great Depression, came in and essentially bailed out banks more than homeowners, they drew these infamous residential security maps in cities like St. Louis, saying where it was a good neighborhood to invest and where it was a risky one. What's interesting in the St. Louis case is, people have found in Minneapolis and in a few other settings, a pretty close relationship between a history of private deed restrictions against racial occupancy and high ratings by the Homeowners Loan Corporation. Because indeed, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which farmed out the appraisal to local realty interests, would generally in their narrative descriptions say, it's a nice neighborhood, it's got some brick houses, but it's occupied by colored people and there are no deed restrictions. So therefore we're going to grade it C or D. Or they would say, it's a pretty nice white neighborhood, but the deed restriction is about to expire, so we're going to rate it B instead of A. Right? They'd make those kinds of assessments. But what's interesting in St. Louis is that holds for the subdivision restrictions. So as we can see, 92% of the parcels that were restricted by subdivision developers got an A or a B grade in the city. But it was not true of the petition restrictions, because the petitions were written in exactly those neighborhoods that the HOLC went into and went, whoa, no way. It's racial transition, we're not going to deal with it. They were defensive. They weren't working very well. As Robert Weaver noted back in 1948, you can't hold back the tide. And so, particularly if we look in the case of the renewals, areas where the restriction was about to expire and they're trying to get it to go for another 25 years, what we see is that far fewer of the homeowners will sign that restriction. It's like, I don't know about this neighborhood. And the HOLC appraisers went in and gave them almost all C and D grades. So they have restrictions on them, but it makes a big difference what kind of restriction it is. And in fact, you also see in the wake of Shelley versus Kramer, something that's not often noted, that is a dramatic increase in African-American homeownership in North St. Louis. Indeed, the rate of African-American homeownership by 1970 is the same as the white homeownership rate in St. Louis, which is very unusual for an American city. But that rests entirely on the collapse of housing values in post-Shelley North St. Louis. And what we found, my colleague Sarah Brooke and I, in related work, is that these homeowners who buy between 1940 and 1970 see the value of their property go almost to zero. And in fact, what we see in the history of North St. Louis is African American homeowners who live in their house for 40 years. Mom or dad dies in the house, the kids arrive to sort things out, and they walk away because the house is worth $8,000, and the parents owed $7,000 to the sewer district when they died. Sort of complete collapse in housing value. This has been characterized by some economists as sort of unintended consequences of Shelley versus Kramer. But it does open up the north side to African American occupancy and homeownership, but not with the same sort of rewards to homeownership that you see in everywhere else. And then I think in some respects, one of the most important adaptations is in zoning. So this is Richmond Heights in central St. Louis suburb. These are the restricted agreements so these are all individual subdivisions that I've mapped so far. And you can see a pretty close relationship between the zoning map of Richmond Heights and the underlying restrictions. Because what happens in part after Shelley is many of these subdivisions, in fact, the majority of them are built on unincorporated land. After Shelley, the homeowners and local planners start incorporating and annexing territory like mad and using single family zoning to lock in those forms of land use. So they can no longer use the racial occupancy, but they can use the economic exclusion that rests on sort of single-family zoning. And as you can see, their large lot single-family zonings map very easily onto where those restrictions occur. And of course, and this is what I've written about more in Mapping Decline and Citizen Brown, it's important to recognize, the long shadow of these forms of segregation. So you have this sort of systematic, sort of patchwork apartheid that divides the city of St. Louis through the first half of the 20th century. But we live with that for the second half of the 20th century and in the 21st century. Part of that, we can go back to Delmar Avenue and see just how long this lasts. So I'm actually living right now, right here. So I see these sort of up close every day. So here's Delmar Avenue, which is that hard boundary to north and south St. Louis. And here's just an illustration of how some of those planning decisions reinforce that boundary. You cannot turn south off Delmar Avenue. The streets all dead end before they get to Delmar. And there are walkways or bike paths to go through, but the car can't go through. Or, you come off Delmar and you get kicked onto an alley and you only go back to Delmar. If we move down, a little bit further, you see the same thing. See these sort of choke points where all of a sudden it turns into a bike path for 20 feet just to prevent vehicular access. Or the streets run one way out of South St. Louis, but not the opposite. And then a little bit further down, Forest Park is playing its role in this boundary as well. The city of St. Louis builds its bus garage just south of Delmar. And again, the surrounding streets just go one way. So, that goes back to my point about the race-restrictive covenants creating the Delmar Divide, but it's sustained by these planning decisions, by zoning Delmar commercial, by widening it, and with all these sort of decisions, the restrictions on vehicular access. In some cases, the one-way streets and the choke points, but also, of course, St. Louis is famous for what are called schmoll pods, which are just big concrete barriers that are put at the end of streets. And you often, you don't show up on Google Maps and you go to turn down the street and it's just blocked off in both directions. And, that yields a pretty stark pattern of black-white segregation in the city of St. Louis. The Delmar Divide, infamously sort of carves the city, but also just keeps running out into the county. So now the majority of African Americans in Greater St. Louis actually live in North County. And, we can illustrate how stark that divide is by looking at these two census tracts, one on either side of the Delmar Divide, and just getting a sense not only of the sort of initial difference, but how stark that difference gets over time. So here are the two census tracts in 1970, and here they are in 2019. And one of the reasons why I sort of follow my colleague Jason Purnell from WashU in sort of picking these adjacent census tracts on either side of the Delmar Divide is the underlying housing stock is virtually identical, built at the same time, by the same developers. So it's really just the way in which that stock has been used over time. But what's remarkable is you can see that the segregation from north to south is barely touched over this long 50-year period. Family income in real dollars actually collapses on the north side to only $20,000, while it rises south of Delmar. As does home value, where you can see a sort of dramatic increase on the south side, the sort of central west end area of St. Louis, but housing prices are essentially flat, and a huge, of course, vacancy rate on the north side. It's 40% of the houses are vacant, and that doesn't count the ones in 2019 that are gone completely, right? They're no longer on the city's tax rolls. And the final illustration of this long shadow that I like to use is from the work of the economist Raj Chetty and his Geography of Opportunity project, where he basically did a sort of big data dive into income tax returns and was able to match the returns of parents with their kids a generation later. And so it's like, what's the impact of growing up in this neighborhood? And so you can see, this is for white kids in St. Louis. You can see lower than median incomes, on the Illinois side, and unsurprisingly in North County. But a median average income for kids who grow up in Greater St. Louis is $54,000. For Black kids, it looks like this. The median income for kids in those same neighborhoods is less than half. And of course, far more systematic across the city and across North County. So, this goes to, what economists and social demographers call just the neighborhood effects or the weathering effects of segregation. Because, it's not just a sort of physical separation of people on economic or racial grounds, but particularly given the way we finance public goods and services, it also means that you start to see a collapse in school quality. You see school closings all over North St. Louis. You see a corresponding collapse in the private economy, sort of food deserts and that sort of thing, employment deserts, poverty in public services. And I think, the importance of that and the importance of doing something about it can be underscored by going back to this sort of early pattern of private restriction, which gives us, what I would characterize as this sort of, apartheid by the numbers, block by block, even parcel by parcel, sense of the way in which the city was carved up and who did the carving. It's important, I think, again, to recognize that how foundational these are to everything that comes after. So, Shelley versus Kramer is not a stark interruption in the pattern of segregation because it's already deeply embedded in the way in which we value property, the way in which we do land use zoning, and the way in which we make other planning decisions like the vehicular access or the zoning that I showed earlier. And again, it's important because, the big Supreme Court decisions, Buchanan v. Worley, Shelley versus Kramer, the Jones v. Meyer decision in 1968 that leads to the Fair Housing Act, are just on paper because they're decisions about things that we have built and we've built into the urban environment, and they don't go away with a court decision. And so I think it helps to build an argument for policies that work to redress some of those underlying inequalities. And I'll leave it there. I do have the St. Louis map is available in a sort of interactive version where you can zoom in and see it on a parcel by parcel level at this section. Questions?
So I'm trying to compile a list of these restrictive covenants for Boone County, Missouri.
Okay.
I'm going into, and I'm looking for volunteers to help me do it, by the way. We flip through books is pretty much what we do. And I've just got one student working with me now. I can use infinite numbers more, but I was curious, those petition ones, are they in the deed books too, or where are they to be found?
Good question. So the petition restrictions are what property lawyers call wild deeds. They're not attached to the property, but they're in the recorded deed book somewhere.
They are.
So the Shelley restriction, for example, is just, so the recorders, I mean, it's a sort of funny thing. The Recorders Act in this part of the 20th century, much more like a public notary. They'll record any kind of document that you walk in, like, I'm gonna rent this piece of my cornfield, right? And so, yeah, we'll record that. And so a lot of what's in the recorders, in the deed books, are not related to a particular piece of property, or not attached to the chain of title for that piece of property. But where you'll find it is sort of a mystery. In St. Louis and St. Louis County, there's a separate I had these separate indices where I could go in and find them. In Waterloo, or in Blackhawk County in Iowa, where the city of Waterloo is, I was looking for these and couldn't find any of them. And then I realized that because they weren't in the sort of grantor or grantee chain of title, that they put them in a separate run of documents. They had a run of what they called miscellaneous records, where they put all the draft deferments and the, adoption records and things.
Call them off deeds.
Yeah. But, and then some of these sort of crowdsourcing efforts don't necessarily show these up because they're not in the chain of title. People can go look at their abstract and they won't find it. So I'm not very helpful or hopeful about this. The other thing is that recorders, through no particular fault of their own, are generally a little bit clueless about the records that are this old. Yeah, where that would be. I come across one occasion.
Wait, I was told you're not gonna find them in there because it was all just word of mouth, and I'm like, no, I'm pretty sure I am, and I did, I found a couple hundred so far, but.
But just by going page by page?
Yes, just by going page by page, it's been a few years now, on and off, when I.
So,
but-
like how many deed books a year in Boone County? 1 or 2?
Oh. Yeah, it's not like.
Yeah, so smaller counties, you can, if you have a group of people that can help you go through it, you can go page by page.
Yeah. One thing that is different that I'm finding than what you're talking about is just about all the ones that I found that say it's running with the land, it's eternal, it is, so your thing about 25 years is mostly not the case in Boone County.
Right. Which is, so one of the funny things about these is they're very rarely actually enforced. And a perpetual agreement would not stand up in the Missouri courts.
Well, no, of course not
Yeah.
now, but as they were written though,
Mhm.
they didn't have these 20, I've only found a couple that have had sunset clauses and it's been the outlier.
Yeah, and sometimes they put in the sunset clauses to make them more legally viable, right? The other thing that you see, particularly after Shelley versus Kramer, is the subdivision developers start to use reversionary clauses because they need another form of enforcement. So there's typically a clause in the subdivisions that says, for this restriction alone, if you allow the house to be occupied by anyone who's not holding the Caucasian rights, the house goes back to us.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of those and I call them clawback clauses.
Yeah, it's in the,
Yeah.
it's called a reversionary clause.
Okay.
And it was seen as another form of enforcement. Although it had the same problem as Shelley, like eventually you'd end up in the courts. And, some sort of public agency would have to say, whose side of the contract gets respected, so.
Other questions? Yes.
Hi, I was wondering, in your talk, you compared St. Louis to Minneapolis, and I was wondering if the history of city-county divorce in both of those cities had something to do with the residential land grab of the city population.
Oh, it's a good question. Minneapolis, which is pretty much in the center of Hennepin County, and most of the Minneapolis suburbs are also in Hennepin County. That project hasn't done the St. Paul side yet. So that's sort of one example. The St. Louis example, the divide between the city and the county is so important in local racial politics because the county municipalities get incorporated to sustain segregation. You see intense use of these restrictive covenants in Ferguson and Florissant and Pine Lawn, all the little inner suburbs that are the first outpost of the white flag. I would say that the big difference between Minneapolis and St. Louis is not like the sort of county structure, but it's timing. Minneapolis does not have an African-American population until the second Great Migration. So Minneapolis has no petition restrictions. They're all subdivision restrictions. They're all done before there's an African-American population of any description. And so they have the effect of sorting the African-American population when it does arrive. Whereas in St. Louis, which has a substantial African-American population, particularly on the north side, you get much more of a sort of reaction to local threats, particularly on the petition side. But you can also see where developers were most active with subdivision restrictions in the county. So I think that's the big difference. So there's interesting work being done now on second Great Migration cities, which would also include Milwaukee, and a very different sort of pattern of restriction. And I'm hoping to do some work in the spring on Philadelphia, which also has, city of Philadelphia and Philadelphia County are almost identical. And then outside, you get the suburban counties. And because the property law is all done at the county level, that can have that dynamic.
Brad?
Yeah, so I was really interested in the categories of people who are excluded in these race covenants. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how, or if at all, potential buyers or renters are assessed. For instance, how do you determine whether someone is wholly of Caucasian blood? Obviously, we all know these things are fictive, but is there a certain pattern in how people go about trying to figure out whether someone is, say, more than 1/32nd
Yeah.
African descent, or any other kind of blood quotient?
So it's very hard to tell how these operated sort of on the ground, in the display homes and that sort of thing. Particularly in the sort of larger, tonier suburbs in Central County, whether the economic exclusion was almost enough, right? I mean, did you have African-American buyers showing up and saying, well, what do you mean I can't buy here? It's not clear that that happened very often. Where it did happen, both in St. Louis and elsewhere, was not along a sort of black-white binary, but other challenges to the Caucasian category. Were Jews Caucasian? And so Paige Glotzer at the University of Wisconsin has written a really good book called How the Suburbs Were Segregated, about the role of big developers in Baltimore in pushing these restrictions. Actually got access to that developer's exclusion files, where they had like memoranda going back and forth about, which Jews were going to let in, which were not. Because clearly, when you go from a laundry list of excluded categories to Caucasian only, it's a bit more sort of capacious and there's a bit more discretion there. There's also a Baltimore case of a Chinese American buyer who claims he's Caucasian because he understands Caucasian to mean not black. But they're not precise categories. In Blackhawk County, Iowa, in Waterloo, what was interesting is their restrictions much more commonly used a sort of eugenics long string. They were often written by Czechs, and they excluded the Bulgarians, kind of thing. But what's really interesting in St. Louis is how rare it is to find a restriction that says no Jews. I have found like 4 total in the city and in the county, partly because they go completely to this sort of Caucasian language where they can use their discretion. But even early on, where it's just racial categories, it's unsurprisingly very much a sort of black-white binary.
Piece of context there, Colin, Brad works on Nazi race laws.
Oh,
Maybe
okay.
partly where that question is coming from. Other questions? Yeah.
Hi, Dr. Gordon. You had mentioned that street widening was used as a strategy to sort of reinforce these restrictive covenants. Could you talk about how often that was used, and in general, how often planners were working with the private sector to coordinate segregation?
Yeah, it's a good question. So it's actually, the fascinating and often sickening thing about writing about St. Louis is, it's one of the northern settings where on race, people just say the quiet part out loud. And so they discuss it quite openly in the 1920s and 1930s. There's a particular sort of debate in the wake of, I will pull up another map, that just at the sort of downtown end of the north side, the tornado comes through St. Louis in 1927. It does a lot of damage. So there's a lot of sort of like, well, we got to rebuild this. And they're quite explicit about like, well, why don't we, do some medians, do some street widenings, and St. Louis as an older city generally has a problem with narrow streets. But they recognize quite explicitly, including, the city engineer, Harlan Bartholomew, the role that wider streets will play. Because they become, like a railroad or like a river, there's limited points of access across them. And what's interesting is the widest streets in St. Louis in 1927 all run next to each other north of Forest Park. So it's like Page and Lindell. And so in some respects, the realtors and the planners were saying, well, which one should we pick as the boundary? And a lot of that, as I suggested, was determined by where black occupancy had been established. So it was sort of a retreat to Delmar in some respects from the southern edge of the Ville. There's some really interesting work that's being done by economists on the role of harbor boundaries like railroads, pre-existing boundaries like railroads and rivers in sorting new arrivals. What's railroads are particularly interesting is you have this sort of hard boundary, often in settings where there are no African Americans or Latinos, and then within migration, it becomes a mechanism for sorting, and so you get this other side of the tracks, which is invented by organizing the school district and the zoning and the residential stuff and the access in that way. And what we see in Waterloo, Iowa, because the Cedar River runs through it, is the river becomes a really important sort of mechanism. In Philadelphia, Fairmount Park, which runs through the center of the city, is a very important sort of hard boundary between black and white Philadelphia. So, and it's, surprisingly talked about quite explicitly at the time about how it will help. They don't often say, hold back the colored population, although sometimes they do. But it's always more talked about more generically as a way of accomplishing what zoning, like a separation of use and a sustaining of the property values of single family districts. That's
A question in front row.
Hi, I've got two very brief questions. One is, I was curious if there's any kind of effect that cities like East St. Louis or Camden and Philadelphia might have on shaping segregation. And then I also just wanted to ask if you could say a little bit about what the argument is that the 1919 riot played a role and why you think the professionalization of the realtors is more sort of.
so the East St. Louis riot is 1917.
Oh, okay.
It's Chicago's 1919. But there is some work in political science and economics that has sort of suggested the roots of segregation in early cities as a response to those episodes of violence. But what I find in St. Louis is that no one talks about it at that time. They're talking about the racial zoning ordinance, and that precedes the riot. And there's no sort of panic response to the riot, like, oh my God. It's really, I think, a combination of responding to the first Great Migration and developing, a set of sort of professional protocols and expectations in this sort of emerging larger scale system of development. Because, it's very important to recognize that what emerges in the 1920s is what is called the sort of community developers. Prior to the 1920s, a developer was quite literally a subdivider. They went in and they sort of carved this farm into 8 pieces, and that's it. That's all they would do. Then you'd have 8 outhouses or septic tanks and wells and that sort of thing. But beginning in the 1920s, you start to have developers that go in and say, okay, we're going to build 100 houses. We're going to do the streets and the sidewalks and the street lights. We're going to hook everybody up to sanitary sewers. We're going to outlaw outhouses and colored people. And then when we're done, we're going to cede all the public stuff back to whatever city or county we're in. And that makes a huge difference in terms of that sort of level of responsibility. So that I think accounts for the timing. Then the first part of your question was
East St. Louis or Camden?
Yeah. So these sort of bi-state metropolitan areas, you often get a sort of, for want of a better word, a sort of ghettoization of the out-of-state suburb. And it's partly driven by all the same things that are driving in St. Louis, although it's not as intentional a displacement. It's just, with deindustrialization, land values in places like Camden and Granite City, Illinois just collapse, and they become like North County, and it's sort of very, very small lot development. An outpost for black flag in the 1970s.
Yes.
I'm just curious how politicians and government officials was this something that they talked about on this legislature, and how did they deal with this? Did they encourage it, or did they just kind of avoid it, or what was that conversation like?
So so do you think mostly at the local level, or
I'm state legislators and at the local level too, but just in general.
So it's important to recognize the way in which, and the limited way in which cities are governed, particularly early in the 20th century. So prior to 1926, cities don't really have a clean constitutional right to zone, to control land use. Because until 1926, the courts pretty consistently hold that if you restrict somebody's use of somebody's land, you have to compensate them. Because it's not, you're not creating a public good. And so cities basically don't do much zoning. And for that reason, they rely a lot on these private restrictions. And so one good example from the St. Louis area is, again, the city engineer, Colin Gordon, who writes the first sort of tracts about the importance of zoning St. Louis in 1918, 1919, quite explicitly says, zoning should replicate and perpetuate the underlying private restrictions. That's the point. By which he meant not just the racial restrictions, but all the other controls over land use. And so for people like Bartholomew, city planners, those who wanted to control land use but were legally constrained, they thought this private stuff was great, and did all they could to encourage it.
Mackenzie, do you have any online questions?
We do.
Yeah.
So we have one from Jacob Lieberson, who's a master's student in the Atlantic program here. And he has kind of a two-pronged question. The first is if the St. Louis Housing Authority has made any effort in recent years to combat the racial divide in St. Louis brought on by racially discriminatory restrictions. And then his second question is, if kind of related to that, if there have been any banks in St. Louis that have implemented minority lending programs for those interested in starting small business.
The answer is yes, but it's a very quiet yes. The St. Louis Housing Authority, now that every city is in full retreat from actually having housing complexes, it's all on a voucher-based system, the housing authorities don't have much say over land use patterns. Who does have a lot of say in the city of St. Louis is the Land Reclamation Authority, which is the city's land bank that takes vacant properties when they fall off the city's tax rolls and try and recycle them. They're not good on this. Partly because the city doesn't do much to prevent land from falling off the tax rolls. And then they're quite happy to sell the same property 5 or 6 times, $6,000 a shot, because basically what happens with these vacant properties is somebody says, a house for $6,000? Cool, and they buy it. But the Land Reclamation Authority requires that you get it up to code within 2 years. You can't do that, it goes back to them, they sell it again. So the city, and so, the 2020 census showed that actually North St. Louis lost another 30,000 people as a result of those policies. The big challenge, of course, is that the city of St. Louis is strapped for resources and has almost always been. And all of the big ticket housing decisions in the city of St. Louis were done when there was a big pile of federal money on the table to do it, right? You could clear large chunks of land, you could rebuild, of course, what they rebuilt was convention centers and casinos and ball stadiums and not housing. So now what's going on in North St. Louis is a very small scale, block by block effort to sort of leverage tax credits, prevent vacancies, keep people in their homes. And that's done by a sort of patchwork of community development corporations with, pretty modest assistance from the city, I would say.
Mackenzie, you have another one?
I do have one other one, which was asked partway through the talk from Travis Fitzwater, another Atlantic MA student. And you kind of addressed this, but if you'd like to elaborate on anything, Travis asks, in your opinion, what are some ramifications present today because of these racially discriminatory regulations, deeds, or contracts in the 20th century? And if I might even add my own kind of addendum to that question, are there any like long-term environmental effects of this segregation that you've been able to find?
The second part, the answer is yes, although it's not an area I do research. But there has been, particularly now that the redlining data sort of exists as big data, you can sort of pull it in. People have done a lot of work, like comparing the red and the yellow zones with contemporary heat islands or Superfund sites or things like that, and finding a sort of close relationship. It's not, a little bit uncomfortable with that line of scholarship because I think there's a sort of awkward causal leap saying, they colored this area red on the map, and so that they condemned it for all time. Often the HOLC is describing what they see in a neighborhood, and in fact, the conditions haven't changed 50, 70, 80 years later, and it's not clear that they caused it. So yeah, the environmental stuff is important. The one thing that I want to underscore, which I've started to do with some of the sort of homeownership stuff, as what I would characterize as, alongside the sort of built environment and continued sort of patterns of segregation that we see in cities like St. Louis, the sort of longest term impact is the racial wealth gap. The fact that not just federal policy, but local policy, zoning, and patterns of segregation create an escalator of wealth creation for white families, and they don't for black families. And it's not because they exclude black families from home ownership. It's because the experience of home ownership for black families is very different, particularly in a setting like sort of North St. Louis. So, unfortunately, none of our good data sources like the census ask any wealth questions, so we don't have any local wealth data, but we do know nationally that gap, is roughly a 10-fold gap between median black wealth and median white wealth. And, as of the latest survey of consumer finances, which is where we get that data, I think it's 2019, the median wealth of African-American families with children is 0, meaning half of them are in debt and, half have some wealth. Whereas, for white families with children, it's more in the order of 100,000. And that's all generational home equity. That's the only place that it comes from.
Yes.
With the established zoning and these hard barriers, I was curious on your perspective of how can we bridge the long shadow? How can we bring tackle inequality within the hard barriered St. Louis?
There's this great passage, I think it's in Slaughterhouse-Five, the Kurt Vonnegut novel, where he imagines the bombers flying backwards over Europe and the bombs coming up off the ground and whatever. You can't undo the damage, right? You can't just say, the city of Minneapolis, for example, as a result of the Matthew Precious project, said no more single-family zoning. But it's not going to make much difference to the built environment of Minneapolis, right? In some areas, it will. So I think you need a more dramatic means of redress than just saying we'll stop doing that shit, because so much damage has been done, and so much of the damage was done, with local and federal resources that are no longer available to undo it. So one thing that we've been working on, it's very difficult to do in Missouri because the realtors got a constitutional amendment on the book in 2010. But the thing that would make the most sense to do would be a small equity tax on residential property transactions over a certain threshold. if you did that, it would have a number of sort of positive and redeeming factors. One of which is the people who have reaped the advantages would pay the costs, right? So you say, you know, single family home transactions over $250,000 pay a 1/4 of 1% tax. Secondly, it's a lot of money. You know, so, you know, the city of Evanston, Illinois, made a big splash in the news for a reparations program funded from their cannabis tax. It's $30,000 a year. This is nothing, right? And so, I mean, it's symbolically important, but it's nothing. But if you take that bucket of single family home sales over $250,000, what do you think that is in St. Louis County last year? The dollar value. It's $10 billion. A quarter of 1% of that is a lot of money. So, you know, it taxes the right people, it raises a lot of money, but it's also, you know, it's the best kind of tax because it's a tiny tax that you're amortizing over 30 years. No one's going to notice it, right? Unfortunately, there's now, as of 2010, a constitutional amendment in Missouri prohibiting taxes on real estate transactions, local taxes on real estate transactions. You could do it through fees. You could like double the recording fees and build up a local equity fund. I think you have to do it locally. I don't think in Iowa or Missouri, you're going to move to the state legislature on this anytime soon. But I think you could do it in St. Louis County and in St. Louis City. But you're not going to do it with public resources. I think, you know, on both practical and equity grounds, you want to tap the private revenue stream that is fueling home prices, and I think that would be the best way to go.
Hey, Colin, I have a question, which is, I know that in the audience here, we have a number of people who are more affiliated with the western side of the state than the eastern side of the state. Is there any comparable work that's been done on Kansas City?
Of course, Kansas City is like, in some respects, ground zero because J.C. Nichols' company invented this, particularly the large sort of country club aspirational subdivision. I don't know. So Kevin Fox Gotham has written a book about this sort of larger pattern in Kansas City. But when he got the restricted covenants, he was like, yeah, I know there's a bunch of them, but you know, for the reasons I talked about, you know, we don't know very much about them. And I think it's a shame in a setting like Kansas City, or if you think of Paige Lotzer's work in Baltimore, that we own, or Robert Fogelson has done some work in LA, we only know about these sort of pretty famous large-scale developers, Olmsted, Nichols, and Meyer in the St. Louis area that do this. But that doesn't give you a sense of what the larger pattern is. To what degree are the small developers mimicking that and doing it on every development? Because, you know, what I found in St. Louis County is it's not like, you know, the Ladue Woods 3-acre with the equestrian path, which is the equivalent of the sort of Nichols-like development. But it's like Ferguson and Pine Lawn, where they're building 5,000 square foot lots for the white working class in 1938. That's where the real damage is being done. And so in this 2-county region so far, we have 1,500 separate restrictive agreements. And so in some respects, I think you need to do it systematically. And I'd be very interesting, both because Kansas City has its own sort of state division that is reflected somewhat on racial grounds, what the pattern looks like in Kansas City, whether they have petition restrictions. The only other city I've ever seen that has petition-based restrictions is Washington, D.C., and they have them pretty extensively as well. For the same reasons, I think.
I knew talking about Kansas City was going to somehow inspire Jay Sexton to ask a question.
Not all about Kansas City. It's a really sobering, kind of a bummer of a talk to end a week, but a real remarkable one. And, love all of how you're in the data so much. And I guess that's my question. It's about one large kind of take on the institutionalization of racism is that it's inherently a kind of modern phenomenon because of the important role played by data, statistics, record keeping, the bureaucratization of government and authority. When you were making the case about why the racist covenants come in the 1920s, and it's like mapping that out on things like immigration restriction, which also relies on all kinds of data and statistics and so forth. So it kind of confirmed what I thought about that, but then the sources that you're using have a real kind of ma and pa feel to them. They're handwritten until the 1930s. It doesn't seem that systematic and well organized. Wasn't quite sure what it was, but you had some of the volume numbers, and you said when you looked it all up, it didn't match up. So it seems kind of ad hoc and willy-nilly. So I guess, what does your story tell us about that broader issue of the organization of data and how important that is to constructions of racial hierarchy with this kind of old, kind of more of a 19th century way of organizing that, these handwritten volumes and so forth. So just an invitation to talk about that topic more generally. But it's striking that there's handwritten stuff until the 1940s in St. Louis.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we want to confuse the sort of ma and pa, sort of unsystematic nature of the record keeping.
Yes.
With that doesn't necessarily tell us that the underlying intent was not systematic,
No.
because what the developers are doing among themselves, agreeing on this language, and the fact that once you get to the recorder's office, it's like a bunch of medieval monks illuminating manuscripts. It's just bizarre. But I think, in some respects, the fact that, I think you could make a more powerful argument for systematic racism in this context by virtue of the fact that every white homeowner and every developer does it as a matter of course, rather than having it be sort of imposed by public policy like our racial zoning law. That is just, just embedded in the practice of private realty and land development during the key half century of urbanization in the United States, particularly in border and northern cities. I do think it is a very interesting question, this distinction between private and public action on this. There's a very good book by two legal scholars called Saving the Neighborhood about restrictive covenants and property law, Carol Rose and Richard Brooks. They make the argument, which I think is pretty compelling, that the act of the recorder writing down the covenant is state action and should be considered state action. It's not just the enforcement, but if you're willing to enshrine these in sort of public records, because it really is rooted in the peculiarly American pattern of property law and property ownership, which is fundamentally based on a suspicion of your neighbors, right? I mean, in no other comparable sort of capitalist democratic setting with private land ownership do you have this absolute refusal to defer to the immediate owner in terms of their claim to the property. It's like, I don't trust you. What if the pin is an inch? I want every piece going back to when this land was first subdivided. Nowhere else do you buy a house and get a telephone book of ragged documents, that record everything that happened. And so that whole form of record keeping, is based on this sort of, settler colonial suspicion or an anxiety about where the property lines land. It's so interesting that it just sort of runs to the present day. And, it's the one reason why people still discover these in their title abstracts today. Because if there's one thing a county recorder will never do, it's remove anything from the record. Right? You can add something. And in fact, in a lot of states, one of the results of this work is a state law which allows someone to add a document, what's called a discharge petition, or just saying, this restriction is unenforceable under Shelley versus Kramer. It's illegal under the Fair Housing Act, also under the Missouri Human Rights Act, and allow people to insert that into your property record at no cost. But right now, you can only do that in a few states. You know, if you wanted, it would cost you $48 to do it in St. Louis County right now, because that's how the recorder works. Sorry, that's sort of a wandering answer.
I think we have time for one more short question, if there's one more question. Yes, Erin.
This is a wonderful talk, thank you. My question comes from the field of public history, and I'm wondering, I'm thinking about kind of the way historic preservation was looked at as a mechanism for revitalizing places like Charleston, but then has this unintended, or actually no, very intended consequence of kind of reinforcing segregation. And I'm wondering whether there's, or at least in your opinion, whether there's any space for the preservation of a lot of these older buildings in this kind of revitalizing these lands that just keep going through the Land Reclamation Authority.
Yeah, and then, I mean, the CDCs in North St. Louis, you know, one of their most important revenue streams, although it's not a big one, is historic tax credits. And one of the arguments they can make, but it's very hard in the absence of any sort of systematic city or federal program to sort of dig in against the larger pattern, which is, you know, sort of vacancy, and then, you know, you rip out all the copper pipes and wires, and then the house is considered, you know, unsalvageable. And the city's, you know, on liability grounds, the city just knocks it down. So the mechanism for, I mean, in North St. Louis, despite the beauty of much of the housing stock, the problem is not historic preservation. The problem is just, you know, allowing elderly homeowners to get their home back up to code, and then, you know, maybe think about that down the road. More often, I think the argument is made in some of these more sort of troubled neighborhoods, you know, ones that have high rates of vacancy, about public institutions. And so there's a big debate now about Summer High School in North St. Louis, and about sustaining that building. Some of the other school buildings, but you know, the net effect, I think, is that you know, as with a lot of that kind of small scale, you know, sort of quasi nonprofit redevelopment, is that the money flows to where it's not needed. You know, so you get a lot of historic preservation in Lafayette Square and South St. Louis, but very little on the north side.
Great, okay, well then let's please join me in. Hope everyone has a good weekend. What's next week? Does someone want to let everyone know what's next week?
They lost the first
Dan
reconstruction.
Goss.